Oh, all right. Thank you for telling me. Yeah, we are back. Good. And so we were talking right before the break about the kind of conflict that Wordsworth was going through. And for him, this was a real crisis, because it not only was a division of loyalties between France and England, but also remember that at this point, his lady love was over there on the other side of the channel. He obviously would not have had communication with her or with their child. And at this time, that also would have been a terrible source of anxiety for him. And he no doubt still would have believed that they were going to get married once they could get together. So, he then realizes, this is still in the 10th book, that he has somehow or another been wrong, or perhaps that he has been betrayed by what happened to the French Revolution. And we have that section dealing with the reign of terror in France and the terrible atrocities which were carried out against political opponents of Robespierre and his crowd in the Committee for Public Security, and the kinds of nightmares that this led to in Wordsworth and others who were just trying to deal with that. And because they believed in the French Revolution, to see what happened in the aftermath of the revolution and how the revolution was betrayed by criminals like Robespierre was just a crushing experience for the young man. Now, you have to realize that one thing is that he's still very young, and another is that he has put a lot of his idealism into the revolution. Okay? And so by the revolution betraying his ideals, he feels somehow or another betrayed as well, and that he has somehow or another undergone some kind of betrayal of his own loyalties and failure. In any event, he undergoes a very serious crisis and even a collapse. So that in the 11th book, in lines 279 and following, we have a section in which he is talking about the kind of crisis and breakdown he went through. So that, for example, in 293 and following, so I fared, dragging all precepts, judgments, maxims, creeds, like culprits to the bar. See, he's trying to hold on to anything he can. Conventional wisdom, passed down truths, calling the mind suspiciously to establish in plain day her titles and her honors, now believing, now disbelieving, endlessly perplexed with impulse, motive, right and wrong, the ground of obligation, what the rule and whence the sanction, till demanding formal proof and seeking it in everything I lost all feeling of conviction, and in fine, sick, wearied out with contrarieties, yielded up moral questions in despair. This was the crisis of that strong disease, This the soul's last and lowest ebb. I drooped, deeming our blessed reason of least use where wanted most. Okay? He's a child of the Enlightenment, which in England was typically called the Age of Reason. And he's tried to use every rational means to explain his feelings to himself and to get himself out of this crisis, and they failed. In other words, deeming our blessed reason of least use where wanted most. So, what is going to work for him? Then it was, thanks to the bounteous giver of all good, that the beloved woman in whose sight those days were past, now speaking in a voice of sudden admonition, like a brook that does but cross a lonely road, and now seen, heard, and felt, and caught at every turn, companion never lost through many a league, maintained for me a saving intercourse with my true self. For though bedimmed and changed both as a clouded and a waiting moon, she whispered still that brightness would return. She in the midst of all preserved me still a poet, made me seek beneath that name and that alone my office upon earth. This is Dorothy, of course, his sister Dorothy. And she's the one who comes along when he needs it most. And she is a kind of steadying influence on him. And she's the one who keeps telling him, you have to stick to who you are and what you are. And so he follows her advice, and eventually he experiences the great epiphany that comes in the 14th book, in the conclusion. And let's look at that by way of concluding our discussion of Wordsworth's poetry, till we get to Coleridge's discussion of Wordsworth's poetry. Okay, so the 14th book, right there in the beginning. He's on another one of his excursions. And people used to do this. They would climb Mount Snowdon, which is a mountain in North Wales. And it's a fairly high mountain, and it's also a very imposing, and it's a very beautiful mountain. And he's going to climb up the mountain with his friend, starting in the night. So that would be a pretty, difficult climb. I mean, climbing at night is not the safest way to mountain climb. And they go through what seems to be fog, but actually it's through the cloud. And they get to the top of the mountain, and they're looking now down on the clouds, illuminated by the moon and the starry sky, and looking out over the sea. And he has a kind of epiphany. A kind of epiphany. Let me put that word on our drawing board over here. What does the word epiphany mean? Anybody have an idea? Yeah.
It's like having a revelation.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. A revelation, yeah. And it's also another one of those words that we take over from religious discourse and use here more or less metaphorically. It's a kind of breaking through from another reality and to another reality. Okay? In one of those excursions, I'm going back to the poem now, in one of those excursions, may they ne'er fade from remembrance, through the northern tracts of Cambria, this is Wales, ranging with a youthful friend, I left Beth Gellert's huts at couching time being the time when most people would go to bed, and westward took my way to see the sun rise from the top of Snowdon. To the door of a rude cottage at the mountain's base we came, and roused the shepherd who attends the adventurous stranger's steps, a trusty guide. Then, cheered by short refreshment, sallied forth. It was a close, warm, breezeless summer night, wan, dull, and glaring, with a dripping fog low hung and thick that covered all the sky, but undiscouraged, we began to climb the mountainside. The mist soon girt us round, and after ordinary travelers' talk with our conductor, pensively we sank each into commerce with his private thoughts. Thus did we breast the ascent, and by myself was nothing either seen or heard that checked those musings or diverted, save that once the shepherd's lurcher, who from among the crags had to his joy unearthed a hedgehog, this is the shepherd's dog, teased his coiled up prey with barkings turbulent. This small adventure, for even such it seemed, in that wild place and at the dead of night, being over and forgotten, on we wound in silence as before, with forehead bent earthward, as if in opposition set against an enemy. I panted up with eager pace, and no less eager thoughts. Thus might we wear a midnight hour away, ascending at loose distance each from each, and I as chanced the foremost of the band. When at my feet the ground appeared to brighten, and with a step or two seemed brighter still. Nor was time given to ask or learn the cause, for instantly a light upon the turf fell like a flash, and lo, as I looked up, the moon hung naked in a firmament of azure without cloud, and at my feet rested a silent sea of hoary mist. 100 hills their dusky backs upheaved all over this still ocean. 100 hills their dusky backs upheaved all over the still ocean. Okay, what are those? Okay, could be mountains. Clouds. Clouds that look like mountains, right? Yeah, the tops of the clouds. They look like mountains. And of course, it's, they're dark. It's nighttime. And beyond, far, far beyond, the solid vapors stretched in headlands, tongues, and promontory shapes into the main Atlantic that appeared to dwindle and give up his majesty, usurped upon far as the sight could reach. Not so the ethereal vault. Encroachment none was there, nor loss. Only the inferior stars had disappeared, or shed a fainter light in the clear presence of the full-orbed moon, who from her sovereign elevation gazed upon the billowy ocean as it lay, all meek and silent, save that through a rift not distant from the shore whereon we stood, a fixed, abysmal, gloomy breathing place, mounted the roar of waters, torrents, streams innumerable, roaring with one voice, heard over earth and sea, and in that hour, for so it seemed, felt by the starry heavens. Felt by the starry heavens. You see, the starry heavens are alive. When into air had partially dissolved that vision given to spirits of the night, and 3 chance human wanderers in calm thought reflected, it appeared to me the type, the very type of a majestic intellect, its acts and its possessions, what it has and craves, what in self it is and would become. There I beheld the emblem of a mind with a capital M. This is a mind, the great spirit that rolls through all things, that feeds upon infinity, that broods over the dark abyss, intent to hear its voices issuing forth to silent light in one continuous stream, a mind sustained by recognitions of transcendent power in sense, conducting to ideal form in soul of more than mortal privilege. And so he speaks now that nature had shadowed there by putting forth mid circumstances awful and sublime. 2 words that the Romantics loved. Awful in the sense of capable of inspiring awe, and sublime, something which is so wondrous that it's really ultimately beyond human expression, and so on. And so notice what he talks about then is he talks about how nature enters into him and he enters into nature, and it's really that kind of commingling that makes him into what he is. And when he experiences this, he is experiencing something like what Coleridge is going to call the primary imagination. And only afterwards, when he recollects this experience in tranquility, can he write poetry about it using what Coleridge is going to call the secondary imagination. So, having said all of the above, let's turn to our good friend Coleridge. So if we can go to the screen, please. Okay, so we've got Coleridge, who wrote a work called Biographia Literaria. Biographia Literaria, which was published in 1817. 1817. And what we're going to be looking at here first is chapter 13, in which he talks about imagination, both primary and secondary imagination, and then fancy. This is what we call faculty psychology. Faculty psychology, a study of human psychology based on the premise that the different activities of our psyches imply different psychological faculties. Memory being one faculty, will being another faculty, imagination being another faculty, rational intellect being another faculty, and so on and so on and so on. That's what is usually called faculty psychology. Okay, we'll come back to chapter 14 in a moment. Okay, let's look at chapter 13 in the Biographia Literaria. This is a very, very famous passage. If you're having trouble finding it, in the 7th edition of the Norton Anthology, which is the one I'm following here, it's on page 477 and 78. The imagination, then, I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now, the infinite I am, that's an echo of, have you ever heard language like that? Sorry?
The Old Testament?
The Old Testament, yeah, it's right out of the Bible. And what is he saying here? Okay, there can be an activity in the infinite I am, viewed as mind with a capital M, divinity, the great spirit that rolls through all things. And the primary imagination is a reenactment in the finite mind, the mind of me or you, in the finite mind, of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. In other words, there is something of the divine in me because there is something about me, at least at the level of primary imagination, which is like the infinite I am. Okay? The secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the former. Now, before we get into his description of it, let me just make one thing clear. What he's saying with primary imagination is something like what Wordsworth was talking about when he was having one of those epiphanic moments. Okay, one of those epiphanies. When he's caught up in that experience the first time round in Tintern Abbey, or later on Mount Snowdon. And it's as if he is caught up in something transcendent, something beyond himself. That is the experience that one has in what Coleridge calls the primary imagination. But when you're caught up in the experience, you can't really write about it. It's going to be the secondary imagination, Coleridge's term, which writes poetry, which creates poetry. The secondary I consider is an echo of the former, but it's not the same thing, just as an echo is not the same thing as the original sound. Coexisting with the conscious will. I mean, it's to some extent, at any rate, under the control of the will. You can will yourself to write a poem, or something like a poem, or a reflection on your experience. Yet still is identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree or intensity, and in the mode of its operation. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. In order to recreate. It dissolves things, diffuses them, dissipates in order to recreate. Or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still, at all events, it struggles to idealize and to unify, to experience and express the unity in things that otherwise would seem to be disparate. It is essentially vital, even as all objects treated as objects are essentially fixed and dead. Okay, and essentially what he's doing is he's saying that in primary imagination we experience unity. Unity with nature, with other human beings, with the heavens, with the earth, with the great spirit that rolls through all things, and that is ultimate unity. The secondary imagination, as a poetic creative faculty, breaks down our normal perceptions in order to reveal to us the inner unity of all things. But notice what we're talking about is we're talking about the subjective experience of the creative artist here, aren't we? We're not talking about objective knowledge as the scientist might understand it. Fancy, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no more than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space, and blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will, which we express by the word choice, but equally with ordinary memory, it must receive all its materials ready-made from the law of association. Now, all he means by that, well, I shouldn't say that because there's a lot packed in here, but what I want to draw out of this is the notion that fancy as a creative activity is something like playing with words, playing with the formal rules of poetry, playing with certain kinds of images, okay? But not with any particular purpose ultimately to lead us to the experience of the unity of all things. Okay? It's much more the concept of poetry as play. Of poetry as play. Okay? Nothing wrong with that, by the way. It's just that from Coleridge's point of view, that is poetry of a lower order than the poetry produced by imagination. Okay? And then he goes on in chapter 14 to make some interesting comments about the collaboration between himself and Wordsworth. During the first year that Mr. Wordsworth and I were neighbors, our conversations turned frequently on the two cardinal points of poetry: the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. The sudden charm which accidents of light and shade, which moonlight or sunset diffused over a known and familiar landscape, appeared to represent the practicability of combining both. These are the poetry of nature. We just saw something like that in the description of the experience on Mount Snowdon. The thought suggested itself, to which of us I do not recollect, that a series of poems might be composed of two sorts. In the one, the incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural. Supernatural. And the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them to be real. Supposing them to be real. In other words, there's one kind of poetry in which at least some of the things presented are supernatural, but they would be presented in such a way as to give them a sense of reality. And real in this sense, they have been to every human being who, from whatever source of delusion, has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency, such as the boy Wordsworth out there on the lake. For the second class, this is a different category of poetry, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. The characters and incidents were to be such as will be found in every village and its vicinity where there is a meditative and feeling mind to seek after them, or to notice them when they present themselves. In other words, these are going to be the things of just ordinary, everyday life, especially here, rural life. But as perceived by somebody who is thoughtful and somebody who meditates on the wonder of these seemingly ordinary things. In this idea originated the plan of the Lyrical Ballads, the book on which they collaborated, in which was agreed that my endeavors should be directed to persons and characters supernatural or at least romantic, something beyond the usual, the everyday, what is usually taken as the real. Yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest in a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination. And this is very, 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 very important, what just follows now. Very famous statement. That willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. Willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. That's quoted over and over and over and over again by people talking about movies, by people talking about poetry, by people talking about painting, by people talking about, opera, by people talking about any of the arts. What does poetic faith consist of? A willing suspension of disbelief is a condition sine qua non for poetic faith. A necessary condition, in other words. Okay? To be able to suspend our natural common sense tendency to disbelieve in what is taking place in the movie is necessary for us to make the act of poetic faith, that is to say, believing that such and such a person or event could be real. Okay? Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and wonders of the world before us. Tintern Abbey. An inexhaustible treasure, but for which, in consequence of the film of familiarity, custom, familiarity, we see the same things all the time, and therefore we no longer appreciate them. And selfish solicitude, we have eyes yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Once again, biblical language, right? With this in view, I wrote the Ancient Mariner. That's what he's doing in the Ancient Mariner. In part, it is a poetic experiment in writing a certain kind of poem. A kind of poem in which things happen which are supernatural events, which seemingly could not happen in our, quote, real world, at least the real world defined by common sense. And yet, in order to appreciate a poem like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we must make a willing suspension of disbelief that constitutes poetic faith in the work in order to enter into it appreciatively. Wordsworth, on the other hand, is going to take the kind of thing that could happen to anybody at any time. You go out in the country, or you go out in your backyard, and you look around and you really see, possibly for the first time, you really see how wondrous it all is. Okay, there's an American poet, William Carlos Williams, who is also an MD, a medical doctor, who, very famous poet of the early 20th century, who followed along with this in the sense that he talked about how he would get up before anybody else in the house would get up, and his family, and he'd go out into the kitchen and he'd be making coffee at the sink, and over the sink was a window, and he'd look out into the backyard, and there was an apple tree. I think it was an apple tree out there, and so at one point it struck him that he had been doing the same thing for something like 15 years, and he'd never really seen that tree. Not ever really seen that tree. And how absolutely wondrous that tree really was. That's the kind of thing that Coleridge is talking about here. Wordsworth doing. I mean, anybody here, I don't, maybe some of you have been to Tintern Abbey. Anybody here could go to Tintern Abbey. and you'd walk around and it's beautiful setting and so forth. But there are lots of places that are beautiful settings. But really to see the wonder in it and to express that in a way that can draw us into the wonder in it, that is the poet. Or at least it's one kind of poet, according to Coleridge. Okay, so, having said that about the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, let's take a look at the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Notice how the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner begins. There are really two different speakers here, but let me go through the list up here. That the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner calls upon poetic faith in the supernatural powers in nature. If you're not willing to grant Coleridge that, then you might as well not read the poem. The form is suggestive of a traditional ballad. Remember I said something last time about how the Romantics were fascinated by antiquity, by the Middle Ages, by things that were old, by things that had come down in folk tradition. The ballad certainly fits the bill in all of those respects. And the form is suggestive here of a ballad. We have two narrators or two speakers. There's the wedding guest, who's the primary speaker in the poem, who encounters the Ancient Mariner while on his way to a wedding. And the Ancient Mariner stops him because the Ancient Mariner is under a compulsion to tell his story. That's a common narrative, by the way, in European storytelling, popular storytelling, folk storytelling. Okay? And we're going to note especially the responses of the wedding guest to what the Ancient Mariner relates. Because this is a tale, not simply about some event, though it may very well have been based on Coleridge having read certain accounts of ships becalmed in the Pacific. And there are scholars who believe that he did read such accounts. And of course, that's what happens here. But beyond that, this is a tale of sin, conversion, confession, penance, and ultimately of redemption. It's ultimately a poem about sin as a kind of fall, but then the path to redemption. And what is the path to redemption? Well, we have to read the poem. Coleridge wondered whether the poem was too heavy-handed, particularly at the end, in moralizing. But that, again, is something that we'll have to think about when we get to the end of the poem. Well, let's look at this poem together. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on certain passages. Obviously, we don't have time to do all of these poems in toto, except for the shortest ones. So we pick out certain passages to focus on. Okay, but let's look at the very beginning, first of all. It is an ancient mariner, and he steppeth one of three. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore steppest thou me? The bridegroom's doors are opened wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set. Mayest hear the merry din. He holds him with his skinny hand. There was a ship, quoth he. Hold off, unhand me, grey-beard loon. Eftsoons his hand dropped he. He holds him with his glittering eye, the wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years' child, the mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone, he cannot choose but hear, and thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. The ship was cheered, the harbor cleared, merrily did we drop, below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top, and so on. So he's a seaman, or has been a seaman, this ancient mariner. And he is telling a tale of how he boarded a ship, and he went off on this ship. And then notice they have ice, storms, for example, 55 and, even 51 and following. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice mast high came floating by. What would that be? Icebergs, yeah, exactly. Exactly. As green as emerald, and through the drifts the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men nor beasts we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound. At length did cross an albatross. Through the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul we hailed in God's name. It ate the food it ne'er had eat, and round it flew. The ice did split with a thunder fit, and helmsmen steered us through. And a good south wind struck up behind, the albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariners, hollo! In mist or cloud, on mast or shroud, it perched for vespers 9. Vespers are what? Evening prayers, yeah, evening prayers, right. Whilst all the night, through fog smoke white, glimmered the white moon shine. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why lookest thou so? And the mariner replies, with my crossbow I shot the albatross. And then skip down to line 91. And I had done a hellish thing, and it would work 'em woe. For all averred I'd killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. Ah, wretch, said they, the bird to slay that made the breeze to blow. And of course they're going southward, and they're going to end up in the South Pacific. Under a hot and copper sky, the sun is beating down on them. Everything is drying out. They're running out of water. They have become becalmed. And this actually used to happen to ships. And the ships would be sighted from time to time by other ships whose sailors would go aboard these ships that they found. And they called them ghost ships because there would be nobody alive on the ship. And nobody would know what happened to them, but nobody would be alive. And here would simply be a ship drifting around. Because what would you do? I mean, if you couldn't catch any winds, there you would be, becalmed in the sea. And eventually you'd run out of food and water. All in a hot and copper sky, this is in 111 and following. The bloody sun at noon, right up above the mast did stand, no bigger than the moon. Day after day, we stuck, nor breath, nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. It's a wonderful image. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Everybody's heard that at some time or another, right? The very deep did rot. Oh, Christ, that ever this should be. Yea, slimy things did crawl with legs upon the slimy sea. Well, okay. Look at the last stanza there. The last two stanzas. And every tongue through utter drought was withered at the root. We could not speak, no more than if we had been choked with soot. Ah, well a day, what evil looks had I from old and young, his fellow sailors. Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung as the sign of his guilt. Well, okay, so look at part 4 now, line 224 and following. The wedding guest. I fear thee, ancient mariner, I fear thy skinny hand, and thou art long and lank and brown, as is the ribbed sea sand. I fear thee, and thy glittering eye, and thy skinny hand so brown. Fear not, thou wedding guest, this body drop not down. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide sea, and never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. The many men so beautiful, and they all dead did lie, and 1,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I. I looked upon the rotting sea, and drew my eyes away. I looked upon the rotting deck, and there the dead men lay. I looked to heaven and tried to pray, but or ever a prayer had gushed, a wicked whisper came and made my heart as dry as dust. He's incapable of praying, even, for some kind of forgiveness. We're going to find out the reason in just a moment. The moving moon went up the sky in 263, and nowhere did abide. Softly she was going up, and a star or two beside. Her beams bemocked the sultry main, like April hoarfrost spread. But where the ship's huge saddle lay, the charmed water burned alway, a still and awful red. Beyond the shadow of the ship, I watched the water snakes. They moved in tracks of shining white, and when they reared, the elfish light fell off in hoary flakes. Water snakes. There are parts of the South Pacific in which there are water snakes, by the way. And see, first he's disgusted by them, but then he changes. Within the shadow of the ship I watched their rich attire, blue, glossy green, and velvet black. They coiled and swam, and every track was a flash of golden fire. Oh, happy living things! No tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware. Sure, my kind saint took pity on me, and I blessed them unaware. The self-same moment I could pray, and from my neck so free the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea. See, when he recognizes the beauty even of these lowliest of creatures, and he recognizes some kinship with them in an act of love, because after all, that's what love is, in one sense, right? What happens? Somehow or another, he is blessed, and he can now pray. And the symbol of his guilt falls off his neck into the sea. Well, so he eventually gets home, again, mysteriously, miraculously, and so we get to the end, and this is at the very conclusion of the work. say 597 and following. O wedding guest, this soul hath been alone on a wide, wide sea. So lonely 'twas what God himself scarce seemed there to be. O sweeter than the marriage feast, 'tis sweeter far to me to walk together to the kirk with a goodly company. The kirk, by the way, is a Scots word for church. To walk together to the kirk and all together pray, while each to his great Father bends, old men and babes and loving friends, and youths and maidens gay. Farewell, farewell, but this I tell to thee, thou wedding guest, he prayeth well who loveth well both man and bird and beast. This is the part that Coleridge thought maybe became a little bit too heavy-handed with its moralizing. He prayeth well who loveth well both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. The mariner whose eye is bright, whose beard with age is hoar, is gone, and now the wedding guest turned from the bridegroom's door. He went like one that hath been stunned, and is of sense forlorn. A sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. Well, okay. Interesting. We go back to the screen just for a moment, please. Let's see. We go back to the screen for a second. Great. So note the responses of the wedding guest, right? That's what is most important from Coleridge's point of view. It's not simply the tale that the ancient mariner tells. It's what effect this has on the wedding guest, because the wedding guest in sympathy responds, in the true sense of sympathy, fellow feeling. He responds to the experience of the wedding, of the ancient mariner. And in doing so, he himself grows to be a sadder and a wiser man when he rises the following morn. So we have a tale, in a sense, of sin, of conversion, of confession of that sin, of penance for having committed the sin in the first place, and ultimately of redemption. Now, as one of our footnotes in the textbook points out, a friend of Coleridge's asked him, I think it was at a dinner party, asked him if he should have written a poem with more of a moral to it. And he said in reply, "But my good madam, the problem with my poem is that it has too much of a moral." Well, again, I leave that to you to decide. But Coleridge's point really is not that a poem should not have some kind of moral or other teaching, perhaps, but that should be implicit rather than explicit. It shouldn't be something that we get beaten over the head with. It should be something that is more suggested, more implied. So, okay. Let us now make a jump, which may seem like a slightly odd jump at first, but I think you'll see my point in just a moment, to Mary Robinson. And I know you've got this in your textbook, but I put her dates up here on the screen just so we can be reminded of when it was that she lived and when she was writing. She was a little bit older than Wordsworth and Coleridge, and she died young, unfortunately, of a mysterious disease about which people are still arguing. She is a newly resurrected woman poet, novelist, and dramatist. And I say resurrected, and I put quotes around the word resurrected, because it's not that she hasn't always been there, but she hasn't always been recognized for the very fine poet that she really was. And some of you who took with me the first half of this course will know that an assignment that I commonly give in British Literature 1, British literature from the earliest times down to the end of the 18th century, is to do an analysis of a woman writer, and to ask the question about what place she has or ought to have in the so-called canon of major English literature. Now let's go to the chart here just for a moment. The notepad. Okay. Nowadays we spend a lot of time in literature courses talking about the canon. What does that word mean? Anybody here know? Have you heard that in your other classes? Yeah. Did you have a... You don't have a microphone? Well, I'll just try to repeat what you say.
It refers to like a group of texts that are considered like great works or reference points for other.
Okay. What she's saying is that the canon consists of a group of works, in this case literary works, which are considered to be great and essential to the culture. Considered by whom, by the way? Who makes that judgment?
I would say academics at the time. Like
Yeah.
leading scholars.
Yeah, she's saying academics or leading scholars. And that's true. That's true. Who has the authority to decide? Let's go back. The word canon is taken over from discussions of the Bible, scholarly discussions of the Bible. I mean, who established and by what means and with what authority what the books of the Bible are? You know, in the case of the Hebrew Bible, it took centuries for the rabbis, to argue it all through and decide what the books of the Hebrew Bible were going to be. In other words, the canon of the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament. And that wasn't just self-evident. And it had to be decided by people who had the authority to make the decision, which means really the power to make the decision. And of course, that power, that authority, belonged to the rabbis. Now, in the case of the Christian or New Testament, there were other gospels around at the time of the gospels that came to be considered the canon. And there were lots of other epistles and so forth that were around in the early Christian church. Why didn't those things get in? Who established the canon? Under what conditions and with what authority? Well, in the early church, those who had the authority and the power made decisions about what went in and what did not go in as authentic works of the Bible, and therefore part of the canon, or what we call canonical texts. There are to this day still some disputes about whether or not certain books of the Bible are canonical. For example, if you pick up a standard Protestant edition of the Bible, you may find at the end of the Old Testament a certain number of books which are called apocrypha, or non-canonical books. Whereas in a Catholic edition of the Bible, those will be included as canonical books. Okay? Now, that distinction is being blurred to some extent as there are now texts of the Bible that are being produced for Protestants and Catholics alike, in which some of the old disputes become muted, at least to a certain extent. But you can see the sort of thing that I'm getting at. So the concept of a canon, as our friend over here pointed out, is that you can have in whatever realm it is, the religious realm, the cultural realm, the political realm, whatever it is, you can have a kind of canon of the works that are accepted to be authoritative, and to be monuments to the culture. Okay? Well, look at a book like this. There's nothing more canonical than the Norton Anthology of English Literature. There are comparable anthologies of American literature, and of French literature, and of African literature, and of Asian literature, and so on and so on and so on. Who establishes, the list of the people who go in or who don't go in? Well, that's very interesting. And with what authority? And of course, it's going to be scholars in this case, right? Scholars are going to decide these things. Wordsworth is so important that notice how much space he's given. Space is at a great premium in these anthologies. And look how much space he's given. That's a sign of how important he is regarded by the people who not only establish but uphold the so-called canon of great writers of English literature. So, going back to the assignment that I give in the first half of this course, which some of you may have taken. Actually, I know that some of you have taken because I look around and see some of you have taken this. I commonly give an assignment to go and find a woman writer. Because women writers usually were either unrepresented or underrepresented in these anthologies. You go back a few editions and you're not going to find very many women. You find one here or there, but not very much. And it's not really so much that people were trying to keep women out, it's just that they weren't seriously looking for the really good women writers who were there all along. And that was a kind of unconscious cultural bias on the part of scholars who were primarily male scholars, of course. Okay? But then not that all men were, suffering from sexist bias by any means, but many were. And it took, in many cases, our women colleagues to draw our attention not only to the fact that there are some wonderful women writers in our tradition, but who they are and what these qualities really are. And so increasingly you will notice more and more attention being devoted to women writers in these canonical anthologies of English and American literature, and literatures of other peoples as well. The same thing, by the way, has also been true of ethnic minorities. It used to be in anthologies of American literature that you just wouldn't find people of color, or you might find a token one here or there. But now you pick up the average anthology of American literature, and you may have as much as a third of the space devoted to writers and other artists and intellectuals of color. Very interesting, very important. And even after we began to recognize the importance of the contributions of African Americans, people began to point out, but wait a minute, we weren't putting any Hispanics in these, and yet there's this extremely rich and creative tradition there as well in America, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Okay? So there has been a kind of turning around. Now, here's Mary Robinson. Go back to my original claim. She is a newly resurrected woman poet, novelist, and dramatist. She's been there all along, right? She wasn't born yesterday. It's just that she hasn't been recognized. She wasn't in earlier editions of these anthologies. However, in her own time, she was much admired by some of her principal contemporaries, including her principal male contemporaries, such as Wordsworth and Coleridge. And she was extremely popular in her own day, much more popular than Wordsworth or Coleridge. One of her novels, when it appeared, sold out an entire edition in one day. I mean, she was a very, very popular writer, and then sank into relative obscurity until she has been resurrected. Let's look at The Haunted Beach. This, once again, is like Coleridge's project, described in the Biographia Literaria, chapter 14, and carried out in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This is romantic poetry treating the mysterious and the supernatural. And in this respect, it is comparable to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Christabel, and it's also comparable in the sense that it's a very fine poem in its own right. Okay. Upon a lonely desert beach where the white foam was scattered, a little shed upreared its head, though lofty barks were shattered. The seaweeds gathering near the door a somber path displayed, and all around the deafening roar re-echoed on the chalky shore by the green billows made. Above a jutting cliff was seen where seabirds hovered craving, and all around the crags were bound with weeds forever waving. And here and there a cavern wide in shadowy jaws displayed, and near the sands at ebb of tide a shivered mast was seen to ride where the green billows strayed. And oft while the moaning wind stole o'er the summer ocean, the moonlight scene was all serene, the waters scarce in motion. Then while the smoothly slanting sand, the tall cliff wrapped in shade, the fisherman beheld a band of specters gliding hand in hand where the green billows played. Specters, ghosts, otherworldly, supernatural figures, or at least supranormal figures. Reminds you, doesn't it, of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in a sense. Okay? And pale their faces were as snow, and sullenly they wandered, and to the skies with hollow eyes they looked as though they pondered, and sometimes from their hammock shroud their dismal howlings made, and while the blast blew strong and loud, the clear moon marked the ghastly crowd where the green billows played. And then above the haunted hut the curlews screaming hovered. Curlews are seabirds. And the low door with furious roar the frothy breakers covered. And for in the fisherman's lone shed a murdered man was laid, with 10 wide gashes in his head, and deep was made his sandy bed, where the green billows played. See, there's some mystery involved here. A shipwrecked mariner was he, doomed from his home to sever, who swore to be through wind and sea, firm and undaunted ever. And when the wave restless rolled, about his arm he made a packet rich of Spanish gold, and like a British sailor bold, plunged where the billows played. The spectre band, his messmates brave, sunk in the yawning ocean, while to the mast he lashed him fast, and braved the storm's commotion. The winter moon upon the sand a silvery carpet made, and marked the sailor reach the land, and marked his murderer wash his hand where the green billows played. And since that hour the fisherman has toiled and toiled in vain, for all the night the moony light gleams on the spectred main. And when the skies are veiled in gloom, the murderer's liquid way bounds o'er the deeply yawning tomb, and flashing fires the sands illume, where the green billows play. Full 30 years his task has been, day after day more weary, for heaven designed his guilty mind should dwell on prospects dreary. Bound by a strong and mystic chain, he has not power to stray, but destined misery to sustain. He wastes in solitude and pain, a loathsome life away. So there's some compulsion here too, which binds him to this place seemingly out of time. And that's very interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting indeed. And there's a mystery here, and you can't completely put your finger on exactly what has happened. I mean, we could try to figure out the mystery and come up with our own solutions to the mystery, and perhaps you could have fun doing that, in your journals if you wanted to. But it's really left for us in a very mysterious way. And so in some respects this is reminiscent of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Notice even the rhymes and the rhythms are similar to those of Coleridge's poem. Later on, the American Edgar Allan Poe is going to be writing poems very much like this, right? Plays with sound, plays with the supernatural, plays with the mysterious. And while Poe has sometimes been looked down on by critics of American literature, in France at least, he's regarded as one of our greatest poets, and he's had a great influence on modern French poetry. Well, let's just briefly mention also that in Coleridge we also have Kubla Khan. And let me just draw your attention to one thing very quickly in the time left to us. I'm just going to read the opening stanza of Kubla Khan. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan, this is the exotic, the far away, the eastern, China. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and there were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. And notice the deep romantic chasm, and so on and so on and so on. This is usually taken as a kind of poem about the artistic imagination, with its subterranean roots and then its bursting forth suddenly, and its love of beauty as signified perhaps by the pleasure dome. Fashioned by the great artist, either Kubla Khan himself or those whom he had employed for creating this place. And then look back to the last poem of Mary Robinson's in our anthology, to the poet Coleridge. And what we have here is a poem which is her response to reading Kubla Khan in manuscript some 16 years before it was printed. And Coleridge had earlier praised her undoubted genius as a poet. So she wrote in response to this compliment from Coleridge, this poem to the poet Coleridge, which is really a kind of poetic commentary on his poem, Kubla Khan. More about this next time.